Prince Alexander Edward Whitmore stood at the tall windows of his bedroom in Ravenshollow Castle, watching the morning mist roll across the grounds. His small hands pressed against the cool glass as he spotted the black carriage waiting in the courtyard below. Today was different from all the other days in his 8 years of life. Today he would leave the safety of the castle walls and enter Elmsworth Academy. The young prince had spent his entire life within the protective embrace of the royal household. His days were filled with private tutors, supervised walks in the royal gardens, and quiet meals with his parents, King Edmund and Queen Isabella. The castle staff knew him well. Gentle Thomas the gardener who taught him about flowers, kind Margaret the cook who always saved him extra cookies, and stern but caring Miss Beatrice who had been his governess since he was 3 years old. Alexander was not like the princes in the stories his mother read to him. He did not dream of grand adventures or battles with dragons. Instead, he preferred quiet corners where he could read books about faraway places or spend hours drawing pictures of the birds that nested in the castle towers. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper most days, and loud noises made him jump. The king worried that his son was too gentle for the harsh world beyond the castle walls. "Your Highness," came a familiar voice from behind him. Miss Beatrice entered the room, her gray hair pulled back in its usual neat bun. She wore her best dress today, a deep blue one with tiny silver buttons. "It is time to prepare for your departure." Alexander turned slowly from the window. His stomach felt like it was filled with butterflies, not the pretty ones from his mother's garden, but nervous, fluttering ones that made him feel sick. "Must I really go, Miss Beatrice? Could we not continue our lessons here in the castle?" The elderly governess smiled kindly, but firmly. She had been having this same conversation with the young prince for weeks. "Your father believes it is important for you to learn alongside other children your age. You cannot rule a kingdom if you do not understand the people you will one day serve." This was true, Alexander knew. His father had explained it to him many times. A king must understand all kinds of people, farmers and merchants, soldiers and scholars, nobles and common folk. The only way to learn about them was to spend time with them. Elmsworth Academy was known throughout the kingdom as the finest school, where children from all walks of life came to learn together. Miss Beatrice helped Alexander dress in his new school uniform. It was different from his usual royal clothes, a simple white shirt, dark blue jacket, and matching trousers. The jacket had the Elmsworth Academy crest embroidered on the pocket, a golden oak tree with deep roots and spreading branches. Alexander traced the design with his finger as Miss Beatrice adjusted his collar. "You look very handsome," she said, stepping back to admire him. Every inch a proper young gentleman. But Alexander did not feel like a proper young gentleman. He felt small and scared. The uniform made him look like any other boy, which was exactly the point, but it also made him feel like he was pretending to be someone he was not. A knock at the door interrupted his worried thoughts. "Come in," Miss Beatrice called. Queen Isabella entered the room, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. She wore a beautiful morning dress of pale green silk, and her dark hair was arranged in an elegant style. But Alexander could see the worry lines around her eyes, the same ones that appeared whenever he had a fever or fell from his pony. "My darling boy," she said, kneeling down to his level. Her hands were gentle as she smoothed his hair. "Are you ready for your great adventure?" Alexander wanted to be brave for his mother. He wanted to stand tall and say yes, he was ready to face whatever awaited him at the academy. Instead, he buried his face in her shoulder and whispered, "I am frightened, Mama." Queen Isabella held him close, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair. She remembered when he was a baby, so small and perfect in her arms. It seemed impossible that he was now old enough for school, old enough to face the world without her constant protection. "It is perfectly natural to be frightened," she murmured. "Do you know what courage is, Alexander?" He pulled back to look at her, his blue eyes, so much like his father's, wide and questioning. "Courage is not the absence of fear," Queen Isabella explained. "Courage is feeling afraid, but doing what must be done anyway. And you, my sweet boy, are the bravest person I know." Alexander did not feel brave at all, but his mother's words gave him a small spark of warmth in his chest. Perhaps he could be brave, even if he did not feel it. King Edmund appeared in the doorway, cutting an impressive figure in his royal uniform. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and kind eyes, though his expression was often serious when he was conducting royal business. Today, however, his face was soft with love and concern for his son. "The carriage is ready," he announced. "Young man, are you prepared to begin this new chapter of your life?" Alexander straightened his shoulders as much as he could manage. "Yes, Papa." The walk through the castle corridors seemed both endless and far too short. Servants lined the hallways, offering encouraging smiles and gentle words. Cook Margaret pressed a small wrapped bundle into his hands, his favorite ginger cookies for his lunch. Thomas the gardener had picked a small wildflower and tucked it behind Alexander's ear, whispering that it would bring him luck. In the main hall, dozens of castle staff had gathered to see him off. These were people who had known him since birth, who had watched him take his first steps and speak his first words. They applauded softly as he passed, calling out gentle encouragements. "Be brave, little prince. Show them what you're made of. We'll be thinking of you." Alexander felt tears prick his eyes at their kindness, but he managed to wave and even smile a little. These people believed in him, even when he did not believe in himself. The castle doors opened, and cool morning air rushed in. The black carriage waited in the courtyard, its brass fittings polished to a shine. The horses, two beautiful chestnuts named Thunder and Lightning, stamped their hooves impatiently. James the coachman stood beside the open door, his weathered face kind but professional. "Good morning, Your Highness," James said with a respectful bow. "Ready for your journey?" Alexander nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. His parents walked with him to the carriage, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. At the carriage steps, he turned for one last look at the only home he had ever known. Raven's Hollow Castle rose majestically before him, its gray stone towers reaching toward the cloudy sky. Flags flew from the highest points, and he could see faces in many of the windows, more servants who had come to watch his departure. This was his sanctuary, his safe place, and he was leaving it behind. "Remember," King Edmund said, placing a strong hand on his son's shoulder, "you carry the honor of our family with you. But, more importantly, you carry our love. We will write to you every day," Queen Isabella promised, kissing his forehead. "And you'll be home for your first weekend visit before you know it." Alexander climbed into the carriage with Miss Beatrice, who would accompany him to the academy and help him settle in. The interior was comfortable, with soft cushions and a warm blanket in case he grew cold. As the carriage door closed, he pressed his face to the window and waved to his parents. The carriage began to move, wheels rolling over the cobblestones with a steady rhythm. Alexander watched until the castle disappeared behind a bend in the road, then settled back against the cushions. Miss Beatrice sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Tell me about the other children," Alexander said quietly. "Will they be like me?" Miss Beatrice considered this carefully. "Some will be from noble families, like yourself. Others will be the children of merchants, doctors, or military officers. The academy accepts students based on their intelligence and character, not just their birth." This both excited and terrified Alexander. He had never met children who were not from royal or noble families. What would they think of him? Would they be kind, or would they find him strange and too quiet? "What if they do not like me?" he asked, voicing his deepest fear. "Then they will be missing out on knowing a very special boy," Miss Beatrice replied firmly. "You have a kind heart, Alexander. You are intelligent and thoughtful. Those are qualities that matter far more than titles or crowns." The carriage rolled through the countryside, past rolling green hills dotted with sheep and small villages where people stopped their work to wave at the royal carriage. Alexander waved back, though he wondered what they would think if they knew how scared he felt inside. As they traveled, Miss Beatrice told him stories about the academy, how it had been founded 200 years ago by a wise scholar who believed that education should be available to bright children regardless of their family's wealth. She spoke of the beautiful library with thousands of books, the science laboratories where students conducted fascinating experiments, and the art studios where creativity flourished. There are gardens too, she said, noting his interest. Quite beautiful ones, with a greenhouse full of exotic plants from around the world. I think you would enjoy spending time there. Alexander perked up at this. Gardens were safe places, quiet places where he felt comfortable. Perhaps the academy would not be entirely foreign to him. The journey took several hours, with only a brief stop to rest the horses and have some refreshments. Alexander nibbled on Cook Margaret's cookies, but found it difficult to eat with his stomach jumping nervously. As the day wore on, the landscape changed. They passed through larger towns with busy marketplaces and grand houses. The roads became wider and smoother. Finally, James called down from his seat. "Elmsworth Academy ahead, Your Highness." Alexander's heart began to pound as he looked out the window. In the distance, he could see impressive stone buildings arranged around green lawns. The academy was large, much larger than he had imagined, with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways. Students moved across the grounds like colorful dots, some in small groups, others hurrying alone with books under their arms. As their carriage approached the main gates, Alexander noticed other carriages arriving as well. Some were as grand as his own, while others were simple and practical. From one elegant carriage stepped a girl about his age with golden curls and a confident smile. From a modest brown carriage came a boy with red hair and freckles, carrying a worn leather satchel. The main gates were magnificent, tall iron bars decorated with the academy crest, flanked by stone pillars topped with carved oak leaves. A uniformed guard recognized the royal carriage and bowed deeply as they passed through. The carriage pulled up in front of the main building, an imposing structure with tall windows and ivy climbing its walls. Wide stone steps led to massive wooden doors that stood open, welcoming new students. Alexander could see movement inside. Older students helping younger ones, adults who must be teachers directing traffic, and an overall sense of organized activity. James opened the carriage door and helped Alexander step down. The young prince's legs felt unsteady as his feet touched the ground. The academy grounds stretched out around him, filled with more children than he had ever seen in one place. Their voices created a cheerful buzz of conversation and laughter that was both wonderful and overwhelming. "Remember to breathe," Miss Beatrice whispered as she took his arm. "And remember that you belong here just as much as anyone else." But as Alexander looked around at the confident, laughing children, he was not sure he believed that at all. He felt very small and very alone, despite Miss Beatrice's reassuring presence beside him. The great adventure his parents had spoken of was about to begin, whether he felt ready or not. A tall woman with graying hair approached them, her smile warm and welcoming. She wore a simple but elegant dress of deep purple, and her manner radiated the calm authority of someone accustomed to managing young people. "Your Highness," she said with a respectful curtsy, "I am Mrs. Whitfield, the headmistress of Elmsworth Academy. We are honored to welcome you to our school." Alexander managed a small bow in return, just as he had been taught. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. I am certain you will find your time here both educational and enriching," the headmistress continued. "We have prepared a special welcoming committee to help you settle in and find your way around. Would you like to meet some of your fellow students?" Before Alexander could answer, and before he could say that no, he would very much prefer to hide in the carriage and return home, a group of children approached. There were 4 of them, 2 boys and 2 girls, all wearing the same uniform he had on. They looked friendly enough, but Alexander's shyness made him step slightly behind Miss Beatrice. The adventure he had been dreading was about to truly begin. The 4 children who approached looked like they had stepped out of one of the adventure books Alexander loved to read. The first was a girl with dark braided hair and bright green eyes that sparkled with curiosity. She carried herself with the confidence of someone much older than her 8 or 9 years. Behind her walked a tall boy with sandy brown hair who kept adjusting his spectacles nervously on his nose, clearly as uncomfortable as Alexander felt. The second girl had striking red curls that seemed to have a mind of their own, escaping from the ribbon that tried to contain them. Her face was dotted with freckles, and her smile was so wide and genuine that it made Alexander feel slightly less terrified. The final boy was shorter than the others, with olive skin and the kind of mischievous grin that suggested he was often in trouble, though probably the fun kind of trouble. "Your Highness," the dark-haired girl said with a perfect curtsy that rivaled any Alexander had seen at court, "I am Lady Charlotte Pemberton. My father is the Duke of Westbridge." She said this with neither boasting nor apology, simply stating a fact. Alexander appreciated that she did not seem to expect special treatment for her noble birth, nor did she act impressed by his royal status. He managed a small bow in return. "I'm pleased to meet you, Lady Charlotte." The tall boy with spectacles stepped forward next, his bow awkward but sincere. "Henry Morrison, Your Highness. My father is a professor of mathematics at the Royal University. I am very honored to make your acquaintance." Henry's voice carried a slight tremor that told Alexander he was just as nervous about meeting new people. This made the young prince feel slightly better. At least he was not the only one who found social interactions challenging. The red-haired girl bounded forward with such energy that Miss Beatrice instinctively moved closer to Alexander, as if to protect him from being knocked over by her enthusiasm. "I'm Emma Sullivan," she announced cheerfully. "Mida runs the largest shipping company in Port Millhaven, and my ma says I talk enough for 3 people, which is probably true because I do love to chat. Oh, and I'm excellent at climbing trees, though Mrs. Whitfield says that's not considered proper behavior for young ladies here at the Academy." Emma's Irish accent was musical and warm, and her complete lack of formality was both shocking and refreshing to Alexander. No one had ever spoken to him so casually, without careful attention to protocol and proper address. It was rather nice, though he had no idea how to respond to such openness. The final boy stepped forward with a theatrical bow that was clearly meant to be amusing rather than respectful. "Marco Benedetti, at your service, Your Royal Highness. My family owns restaurants in 3 different kingdoms, and I can already cook better than most adults. Also, I know every secret passage in this academy, though officially I'm not supposed to tell new students about them on their first day." Mrs. Whitfield cleared her throat meaningfully, and Marco grinned sheepishly but showed no real remorse for his hint about unauthorized exploration. "These 4 students," Mrs. Whitfield explained to Alexander, "have volunteered to serve as your welcoming committee. They will help you find your classes, show you around the grounds, and assist you in settling into academy life. Lady Charlotte is our head girl for the younger students, so she is quite experienced in helping newcomers feel at home." Alexander looked at the 4 faces watching him expectantly and felt overwhelmed. They all seemed so confident, so comfortable in their own skins. Even Henry, who was clearly shy like himself, had managed to introduce himself properly. What was he supposed to say to them? "Thank you," he managed quietly. "I am grateful for your kindness." Miss Beatrice squeezed his shoulder encouragingly. She had been dreading this moment too, not because she did not think Alexander would thrive at the academy, but because she knew how difficult transitions were for him. The boy needed time to adjust to new situations, time to observe and understand before he felt comfortable participating. "Perhaps," Miss Beatrice suggested diplomatically, "we might begin with a tour of the grounds? His Highness is quite interested in gardens and libraries." Emma clapped her hands together excitedly. "Oh, the gardens are absolutely magical. Wait until you see the rose maze and the lily pond. And the library. Henry practically lives there, don't you, Henry? He's read more books than some of the teachers, I'd wager." Henry pushed his spectacles up his nose and blushed. "I do enjoy reading. There are some fascinating volumes on natural philosophy and astronomy. And the kitchen gardens," Marco added with obvious pride, "grow the most wonderful herbs and vegetables." Chef Robertson lets me help with the cooking sometimes, and he's teaching me to make proper French sauces. Charlotte maintained her more dignified demeanor, but smiled warmly. We shall show you everything, Your Highness. The academy is quite beautiful, and I believe you will find it a pleasant place to spend your school years. Mrs. Whitfield nodded approvingly. Excellent. Miss Beatrice, while the children conduct their tour, perhaps you would join me for tea? We can discuss His Highness's academic schedule and any special accommodations that might be helpful. The idea of Miss Beatrice leaving him, even temporarily, made Alexander's stomach clench with anxiety. She had been a constant presence in his life for 5 years, and the thought of navigating this new environment without her felt impossible. Miss Beatrice seemed to sense his distress. Perhaps I might join the tour as well? I am quite interested in seeing the facilities myself. Of course, Mrs. Whitfield agreed graciously. We want His Highness to feel as comfortable as possible during this transition. The group set off across the main courtyard, with Charlotte taking the lead in her role as guide. Alexander walked between Miss Beatrice and Henry, grateful to be flanked by the two quietest members of the group. Emma bounced along beside them, chattering cheerfully about everything they passed, while Marco kept pointing out interesting architectural features and hinting at the mysterious secret passages he claimed to know about. The academy was indeed beautiful. The main building was constructed of warm golden stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. Ivy climbed the walls in elegant patterns, and tall windows offered glimpses into classrooms where students were engaged in various lessons. They passed a window where younger children were practicing their letters, their tongues poking out in concentration as they carefully formed each stroke. That's the junior classroom, Charlotte explained. Children aged 6 and 7 study there. You'll be in the intermediate level with us, ages 8 to 10. The senior students, 11 to 13, have their own wing of the building. They walked along a covered pathway that connected the main building to what Charlotte identified as the science building. Through the windows, Alexander could see older students bent over strange apparatus, mixing colored liquids and observing the results. One experiment produced a cloud of purple smoke, which made Emma giggle with delight. Professor Darwin teaches natural philosophy and chemistry, Henry explained, his eyes lighting up with interest. He says that understanding the natural world through observation and experimentation is one of the most important skills we can develop. Last month, we grew crystals and studied how they form their patterns. The enthusiasm in Henry's voice was infectious, and Alexander found himself genuinely curious about these experiments. At the castle, his science education had consisted mostly of reading about discoveries that other people had made. The idea of making his own observations and discoveries was appealing. Their next stop was the library, and Alexander's breath caught his throat when Charlotte opened the heavy wooden doors. The room was magnificent, 2 stories high, with balconies running along the upper level and rolling ladders to reach the highest shelves. Thousands of books lined the walls, their leather bindings creating a rainbow of colors from deep burgundy to forest green to midnight blue. Tall windows let in streams of golden light that illuminated reading tables scattered throughout the space. A few older students sat quietly studying, while a teacher helped 2 younger children find books appropriate for their reading level. The air smelled of aged paper and leather and something indefinable that made Alexander think of wisdom and adventure. "Oh my," Miss Beatrice murmured. "This is quite impressive." Henry beamed with pride as if he had built the library himself. "There are over 10,000 volumes," he said. "Fiction, poetry, history, science, philosophy, geography, anything you could possibly want to learn about. And Mrs. Hartwell, the librarian, can help you find books on any subject that interests you." An elderly woman with silver hair looked up from behind the main desk and smiled at the group. "Welcome to our sanctuary of learning," she said in a voice soft as velvet. "You must be Prince Alexander. I have already set aside several books that I thought might interest a young man with royal responsibilities," histories of great kingdoms, tales of wise rulers, and some excellent adventure stories for when you want to read purely for pleasure. Alexander felt himself blush at her thoughtfulness. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell. That is very kind. Reading is one of life's greatest joys," she continued. "I hope you will consider this library your second home during your time at the academy." As they left the library, Alexander realized that his shoulders had relaxed slightly. The oppressive weight of anxiety that had been crushing his chest all morning had lightened just a bit. Perhaps this place would not be entirely foreign and frightening. There were books here, and kind people, and students who seemed genuinely interested in learning. Emma, who had been remarkably quiet during their library visit, burst back into chatter as soon as they were outside. "Now for the best part, the gardens. Oh, Your Highness, you're going to love them. They're even more beautiful than the royal gardens, though I probably shouldn't say that since you're a prince and all." The gardens were indeed spectacular. They had been designed with the same care and attention as the buildings, creating outdoor classrooms where students could study botany, conduct nature observations, and simply find peaceful spaces for quiet reflection. Neat gravel paths wound between carefully tended beds of flowers, herbs, and vegetables. Alexander was immediately drawn to a section where roses climbed elegant trellises, their blooms ranging from pure white to deep crimson. The sweet fragrance reminded him of his mother's favorite perfume, and for a moment, homesickness threatened to overwhelm him. "The rose garden is lovely," Charlotte observed, noticing his interest. "Many students like to study here when the weather is fine. It's quite peaceful." They continued past beds of lavender that hummed with contented bees, through a kitchen garden where vegetables grew in neat rows, and, finally, to what Emma had called the lily pond. It was a circular pool surrounded by carefully arranged stones, with water lilies floating serenely on the surface. A small fountain in the center created gentle ripples that caught and scattered the sunlight. "Sometimes," Henry said quietly, "I come here to think, when the mathematics problems get too complicated or when I'm feeling overwhelmed by everything. The water is very calming." Alexander could understand this perfectly. The pond was indeed peaceful, with the soft sound of water and the gentle movement of the lilies creating an atmosphere of tranquility. He could imagine sitting here with a book, or simply watching the patterns the water made as it moved. Marco had been growing increasingly restless during their garden tour, and now he could contain himself no longer. "This is all very nice," he said diplomatically, "but don't you think His Highness should see some of the more exciting parts of the academy, like the old tower or the tunnel that connects the kitchen to the main building?" Mrs. Whitfield had specifically instructed the welcoming committee to keep their tour to approved areas, but Marco had a talent for creative interpretation of rules. Technically, she had not forbidden them from mentioning interesting architectural features. Charlotte shot him a warning look. "Marco, we should stick to the main areas for today." "But the old tower has the most amazing view of the whole valley," Marco protested. "And it's perfectly safe, well, mostly safe. And the tunnel isn't really secret anymore, since Chef Robertson uses it every day." Alexander found himself intrigued despite his natural caution. "There's truly a tunnel beneath the academy." "Oh yes," Emma said excitedly. "It was built ages ago when the academy was first constructed. They wanted to be able to move supplies from the kitchen to the dining hall, even in bad weather. Marco discovered it completely by accident during his first week here. "I was exploring," Marco said with obvious pride. "I have a gift for finding hidden places. My parents say it comes from spending so much time in restaurant kitchens. You learn to notice doors and passages that most people overlook." Miss Beatrice looked concerned about this discussion of unauthorized exploration, but before she could intervene, a bell began to ring somewhere across the campus. The sound was rich and melodious, calling students back to their afternoon lessons. "That's the class bell," Charlotte explained. "We should return to the main building. Your Highness, you'll be joining us for afternoon lessons, literature, and history today, I believe." As they walked back toward the main building, Alexander felt his anxiety returning full force. Meeting these 4 students individually had been manageable, but Now he would be entering a classroom full of children he did not know. What if they stared at him? What if they expected him to be different from other children? What if he said something foolish and embarrassed himself? The classroom they entered was bright and welcoming, with large windows overlooking the gardens they had just visited. About 15 students were taking their seats at wooden desks arranged in a horseshoe shape. Some looked up with curiosity as Alexander entered with his escorts, while others were too busy organizing their books and papers to pay much attention. A young man with kind brown eyes and a neatly trimmed beard stood at the front of the room. He wore simple but well-tailored clothes and had the easy manner of someone who genuinely enjoyed working with children. "Class," he said in a pleasant voice, "we have a new student joining us today. Prince Alexander, would you like to introduce yourself to your classmates?" Every head in the room turned toward Alexander, and he felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. 15 pairs of eyes watched him expectantly, waiting to see what kind of person their royal classmate would turn out to be. Some faces showed friendly curiosity, others seemed impressed by his title, and a few appeared to be reserving judgment. Alexander's mouth felt dry as sand. This was the moment he had been dreading most, standing before a group of strangers and trying to find words that would make them accept him. At the castle, conversations were formal and predictable. Here, he had no idea what these children expected from him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched on, becoming more awkward with each passing second. He could feel Miss Beatrice's concerned gaze from her position near the back of the room, and saw Charlotte giving him an encouraging smile from her desk. He began, then stopped. What could he possibly say that would matter to these children? That he was a prince? They already knew that. That he was nervous? That seemed weak and unprincely. That he hoped they would be friends with him? That sounded desperate. The teacher, Mr. Brennan, seemed to recognize his distress. "Why don't you tell us something about your interests, Alexander? What do you enjoy doing in your free time?" This was easier. Alexander could talk about things he loved, even if his voice was barely audible. "I enjoy reading," he said quietly, "and drawing, and learning about plants and animals." A girl with blonde braids raised her hand eagerly. "What kind of books do you like best?" "Adventure stories," Alexander replied, his voice growing slightly stronger, "and books about distant lands and different peoples." "Have you read The Chronicles of Captain Blackwood?" asked a boy with dark hair. "It's about a ship captain who discovers a lost civilization." Alexander's face lit up with genuine interest. "I have read the first 3 volumes. I have been waiting for the 4th to be published." "I have it," the boy exclaimed. "My uncle sent it to me from the capital. You can borrow it if you'd like." For the first time since arriving at the academy, Alexander smiled a real smile. Not the polite, careful expression he had been wearing all day, but a genuine expression of pleasure and gratitude. "I would like that very much," he said. "Thank you." And just like that, the ice was broken. The literature lesson that followed Alexander's introduction turned out to be far more engaging than he had expected. Mr. Brennan had a gift for bringing stories to life, using different voices for characters and encouraging students to act out dramatic scenes. When he read from a tale about brave knights rescuing a village from bandits, he assigned roles to various students, including Alexander. "Prince Alexander," Mr. Brennan said with a theatrical flourish, "you shall be Sir Galahad, the young knight who discovers the bandits' secret weakness." Alexander's first instinct was to shrink back and ask for a smaller role, but something about Mr. Brennan's encouraging manner and the expectant faces of his classmates made him nod instead. As he stood at the front of the classroom, pretending to ride a noble steed and deliver the crucial information that would save the village, he found himself actually enjoying the performance. The boy who had offered to lend him the Captain Blackwood book, William, as Alexander learned, played the role of the bandit chief with such dramatic flair that he had the whole class laughing. Emma threw herself into her role as the village baker who rallied the townspeople, while Marco played a comic sidekick who kept getting into amusing mishaps. For the first time in his young life, Alexander felt what it was like to be just another child in a group of children all working together to create something fun and imaginative. No one treated him differently because of his title. When he forgot his line, Charlotte whispered it to him helpfully. When he stumbled over a dramatic gesture, Henry offered a supportive smile. It was wonderful and terrifying all at once. When the bell rang for the end of the lesson, Alexander was surprised to realize that nearly 2 hours had passed. The afternoon had flown by in a way that castle lessons never did. As students gathered their books and prepared to move to their next class, several approached him with friendly offers. "Would you like to sit with us at dinner?" asked a girl named Sarah, who had played the village elder in their dramatic performance. "There's going to be a chess tournament next week," William mentioned. "Do you play? We could use more participants." "Oh, and tomorrow is Saturday," Emma added excitedly. "We have free time in the afternoons on weekends. We could explore more of the gardens, or Marco could show you some of his secret passages if Mrs. Whitfield says it's all right." Alexander felt overwhelmed by their kindness. These children barely knew him, yet they were welcoming him into their activities and friendships as if he had always been part of their group. It was more acceptance than he had dared hope for. "I would like all of those things very much," he said, and meant it completely. Miss Beatrice, who had been observing from the back of the classroom, felt a surge of relief and pride. She had worried that Alexander's shyness would make it difficult for him to connect with his peers, but she could see him beginning to relax and engage naturally. Perhaps King Edmund's insistence on sending him to the academy would prove to be exactly what the boy needed. Their next class was history, taught by Professor Aldrich, an elderly gentleman with a magnificent white beard and a passion for bringing the past to life. His classroom was decorated with maps, ancient weapons, and artifacts from various periods of history. Suits of armor stood in the corners like silent sentinels, and tapestries depicting famous battles hung from walls. "Today," Professor Aldrich announced as students took their seats, "we shall explore the concept of leadership through the ages. What makes a good leader? How do the great rulers of history inspire loyalty and achieve lasting success?" Alexander felt a flutter of anxiety. This topic struck very close to home, as one day he would be expected to rule his own kingdom. What if the professor called on him to provide examples? What if the other students expected him to have special insights because of his royal birth? Professor Aldrich began by discussing various types of leadership styles, from the military genius of great generals to the diplomatic skills of peacemaking monarchs. He spoke of leaders who ruled through fear versus those who inspired through example, of the importance of understanding the people you lead, and of the courage required to make difficult decisions for the greater good. "Leadership," he said, stroking his beard thoughtfully, "is not about commanding others to do your will. True leadership is about service, serving your people, your cause, your principles." The greatest leaders in history were those who understood that their power came with the responsibility to use it wisely and justly. As he spoke, Alexander found himself thinking of his father. King Edmund was exactly the kind of leader Professor Aldrich was describing, a man who took his responsibilities seriously, who listened to his advisors but made his own decisions, who always considered what was best for his people rather than what was easiest for himself. Can anyone give me an example of a leader who demonstrated these qualities? Professor Aldrich asked the class. Several hands shot up. Charlotte mentioned Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had been both a powerful ruler and a patron of the arts. Henry talked about the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius, who had tried to govern according to principles of wisdom and justice. William brought up Admiral Nelson, whose courage and tactical brilliance had saved his nation from invasion. "Excellent examples," Professor Aldrich said approvingly. "Now, what about leadership in smaller contexts? Leadership does not require a crown or a title. How might a young person demonstrate leadership qualities?" Emma raised her hand. "By standing up for someone who's being treated unfairly. By helping organize a group project when everyone else is confused," suggested Sarah. Marco grinned. "By knowing where all the best hiding spots are and helping younger kids avoid the older bullies." This last comment drew laughter from the class, though Professor Aldrich's expression suggested he was not entirely sure whether Marco was joking or speaking from experience. All excellent points, the professor said. Leadership can be demonstrated through courage, organization, knowledge, and protective instincts. It is about recognizing when action is needed and being willing to step forward, even when it would be easier to remain silent or invisible. Alexander thought about this as the lesson continued. He had always assumed that leadership was something he would have to learn when he was older, when he was officially trained to take over royal duties. But Professor Aldrich seemed to be suggesting that leadership was something that could be practiced and developed at any age, in any situation. As they discussed historical examples of young leaders, Joan of Arc, who had been only 17 when she convinced the French court to let her lead military campaigns, or Alexander the Great, who had begun his conquests as a teenager. Alexander began to wonder if perhaps his own timid nature was something he could work to overcome. The class was interrupted by commotion in the hallway outside. Loud voices, heavy footsteps, and what sounded like someone crying echoed through the corridor. Professor Aldrich frowned and moved toward the door to investigate. Before he could reach it, the classroom door burst open and a small boy stumbled inside, tears streaming down his face and his uniform disheveled. He looked to be about 6 years old, one of the youngest students at the academy. Behind him came two older boys, perhaps 11 or 12, with a swagger of students who thought themselves quite important. "Give it back, Thompson," the little boy sobbed. "It's mine." One of the older boys, a tall youth with an unpleasant sneer, dangled a small wooden toy horse just out of the little boy's reach. "Finders keepers, baby. Maybe next time you won't leave your precious toy where anyone can take it." The second older boy laughed mockingly. "Besides, aren't you too old for toys? This is an academy for serious students, not a nursery for little children and their playthings." Professor Aldrich's face darkened with disapproval. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Blake, returned that item immediately and apologized to young Master Timothy. We found it lying around," Thompson said with false innocence. "How are we to know it belonged to anyone in particular?" This was clearly a lie. Timothy's wooden horse was beautifully crafted and painted, obviously a treasured possession rather than something that would be carelessly left behind. The older boys were simply taking advantage of their size to bully someone smaller and more vulnerable. Alexander felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach as he watched the confrontation unfold. This was exactly the kind of situation he had always tried to avoid. Conflict, raised voices, the potential for unpleasantness. His instinct was to look away, to stay quiet, and hope that someone else would handle the problem. But as he watched little Timothy's distress, something else stirred within him. Professor Aldrich had just been speaking about leadership, about the courage to step forward when action was needed. The older boys were being cruel to someone who could not defend himself effectively. And while Professor Aldrich had the authority to intervene, it was clear that Thompson and Blake were testing boundaries to see what they could get away with. Charlotte was sitting rigidly in her seat, clearly wanting to help, but uncertain whether it was her place to intervene in a situation involving older students. Henry looked distressed, but seemed frozen by the same social uncertainty. Emma's hands were clenched into fists, and she looked ready to explode into action, but even her natural boldness was constrained by the Academy's expectations of proper behavior. Alexander found himself standing up before he had consciously decided to do so. His heart was pounding, and his palms were sweaty, but something about Timothy's tears and the bully's smug expressions had awakened something protective within him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but clear enough to carry across the room. The older boys turned to look at him with surprise and poorly concealed annoyance. They had been focused on intimidating a small child and had not expected to be challenged by anyone else, particularly not by someone who looked as young and mild as Alexander. "Yes," Thompson said with exaggerated politeness that bordered on mockery. "Did you want something, little prince?" The emphasis he placed on Alexander's title was clearly intended as an insult, suggesting that he thought royal privilege was the only reason anyone would listen to Alexander. Several students in the class shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the disrespect in Thompson's tone. Alexander felt his face flush with embarrassment, but he did not sit back down. "That horse belongs to Timothy," he said, his voice growing slightly stronger. "Please return it to him." Blake laughed outright. "Oh, how cute. The little prince thinks he can order us around. What are you going to do if we don't give it back? Send for your royal guards?" This drew a few nervous chuckles from some of the students, though Alexander noticed that Charlotte, Emma, Henry, and Marco were all watching him with expressions of support rather than amusement. Even William and Sarah looked ready to back him up if needed. Alexander took a deep breath and tried to remember everything his father had taught him about dignity and calm authority. Kings did not rule through shouting or threats, but through the quiet confidence that came from knowing what was right and being willing to stand behind it. "I am not ordering you," Alexander said calmly. "I am asking you to do what is right. That horse clearly means a great deal to Timothy, and taking someone's treasured possession is neither kind nor honorable." "Honorable?" Thompson scoffed. What would a pampered little prince know about honor? But something in Alexander's manner seemed to be affecting the mood of the room. He had not raised his voice or made any threats. He had not mentioned his royal status or suggested that there would be consequences for defying him. Instead, he had simply stated the truth quietly and with obvious sincerity. Professor Aldrich was watching with interest, clearly ready to intervene if necessary, but curious to see how the situation would unfold. He had been teaching at the academy for 30 years and had learned to recognize teachable moments when he saw them. "I know," Alexander said, still speaking quietly, "that honor means treating others with kindness and respect, especially those who are smaller or more vulnerable than yourself. I know that true strength comes from protecting others, not from using your advantages to cause them distress." He paused, looking directly at Thompson and Blake. "And I know that the horse you are holding belongs to Timothy, and that keeping it would be theft, regardless of how you choose to justify it." The simple directness of his words seemed to cut through the bluster and posturing. Thompson's sneer faltered slightly, and Blake looked less certain of himself. Several other students were now watching with obvious approval of Alexander's intervention. Little Timothy had stopped sobbing and was watching Alexander with something approaching awe. In his young experience, older children usually either ignored his problems or made them worse. The idea that someone would stand up for him, especially someone important like a prince, was almost too wonderful to believe. Furthermore, Alexander continued, his confidence growing as he realized that his words were having an effect, "I believe that students at Elmsworth Academy are expected to conduct themselves with dignity and respect for their fellow scholars. Bullying younger students hardly seems consistent with the Academy's reputation for producing young people of character." This was a masterstroke. By appealing to the Academy's standards rather than his own authority, Alexander had given Thompson and Blake a way to comply without losing face completely. They could return the horse because it was the right thing to do according to Academy values, not because they had been commanded to do so by a younger student. Professor Aldrich stepped forward, his expression grave, but approving. "Prince Alexander speaks wisely," he said. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Blake, you will return Master Timothy's property immediately and offer him an appropriate apology. Then, you will report to my office after classes for a discussion about appropriate behavior toward younger students." Faced with direct orders from a teacher and the obvious disapproval of most of the room, Thompson reluctantly handed the wooden horse back to Timothy. His apology was grudging and insincere, but at least it was audible. As the older boys filed out of the room with as much dignity as they could muster, Timothy clutched his horse and looked up at Alexander with shining eyes. "Thank you, Your Highness," he whispered. "You're very brave." Alexander knelt down to Timothy's level, his heart still pounding from his first real act of leadership. "You are very welcome, Timothy. And please just call me Alexander." Word of Alexander's intervention and the bullying incident spread through the academy with the speed that only school gossip can achieve. By the time the afternoon classes ended and students began making their way to the dining hall for dinner, Alexander found himself the recipient of countless curious glances, approving nods, and whispered conversations that stopped when he drew near. He was not entirely comfortable with this attention, but he noticed that it felt different from a nervous scrutiny he had experienced earlier in the day. This time, students seemed to be looking at him with respect rather than mere curiosity about his royal status. Several younger children whom he did not even know offered him shy smiles as he passed, and a few older students nodded at him with what appeared to be approval. "That was brilliantly done," Charlotte said as their group walked toward the dining hall. "I have wanted to do something about Thompson and Blake for weeks, but I was never certain how to approach the situation diplomatically." Emma was practically bouncing with excitement. "Did you see their faces when you talked about honor and dignity?" Thompson looked like he had swallowed a particularly sour lemon. Henry adjusted his spectacles and smiled. "You showed remarkable composure under pressure, Alexander. Public speaking makes me terribly nervous, but you handled yourself with great poise." Marco grinned and clapped Alexander on the shoulder in a gesture of friendship that would have been utterly impossible at the formal royal court. "I knew there was more to you than just fancy manners and royal titles. Anyone who stands up to bullies is all right by me." Alexander felt a warm glow of pride at his new friend's approval, but he also felt slightly embarrassed by their praise. "I simply did what anyone should have done," he said modestly. "Timothy needed help, and it seemed wrong to pretend I had not noticed. But lots of people notice unfairness and still do nothing about it," Emma pointed out practically. "Doing the right thing when it's difficult takes real courage." Miss Beatrice, who had witnessed the entire incident, felt a surge of pride that she could hardly contain. She had watched Alexander struggle with shyness and self-doubt for years, always wondering if he would find the inner strength that she was certain he possessed. Today, he had proven that underneath his gentle exterior lay the heart of a true leader. The dining hall was a magnificent room with high ceilings, tall windows, and long wooden tables that could seat the Academy's entire student body. Paintings of famous scholars and historical scenes decorated the walls, and chandeliers provided warm, welcoming light. The mingled aromas of roasted meat, fresh bread, and sweet desserts filled the air, making Alexander realize how hungry he was. Students were seated according to age groups, with the youngest children at tables near the front of the room where teachers could easily supervise them, and the oldest students toward the back where they could enjoy slightly more independence. Alexander's group was directed to a table in the middle section, perfectly positioned to observe the entire social ecosystem of the Academy. As they took their seats, Alexander noticed that several students from other tables were stealing glances in his direction. Some looked curious, others impressed, and a few seemed to be whispering among themselves with obvious excitement. He tried to ignore the attention and focus on the conversation at his own table. The meal was excellent: roasted chicken with herbs from the Academy gardens, fresh vegetables, warm bread with butter, and a selection of puddings for dessert. Alexander found that his appetite had returned with a vengeance after the stressful events of the day, and he ate with more enthusiasm than he had shown for food in weeks. "The Academy cuisine is quite good," Charlotte observed, noticing his appreciation. "Chef Robertson takes great pride in providing nutritious and delicious meals. He says that proper nutrition is essential for proper learning. He also lets me help in the kitchen sometimes," Marco added proudly. "I've been learning to make pasta from scratch, and he's promised to teach me the secret to his famous apple tarts." Emma rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Marco thinks about food almost as much as he thinks about secret passages. It's a wonder he has time for his actual studies. Food is important." Marco protested with mock indignation. "Besides, cooking requires many of the same skills as academic subjects: precision, timing, creativity, and the ability to follow complex instructions." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually quite true. There are mathematical principles involved in measuring ingredients, chemical reactions in baking, and even artistic elements in presentation." As they talked, Alexander found himself relaxing in a way that would have seemed impossible just that morning. The conversation flowed naturally from topic to topic. Favorite books, interesting classes, amusing incidents from previous school years, plans for the upcoming weekend. No one seemed to expect him to be different or special because of his royal birth. He was simply Alexander, a new student who was learning to find his place among his peers. Partway through the meal, a commotion near the younger students' tables caught everyone's attention. Little Timothy, the boy whom Alexander had helped earlier, was standing on his chair with his wooden horse held high above his head like a trophy. "This is my horse," he announced to his tablemates in a clear, proud voice. And Prince Alexander saved it from the mean boys, and he said I should call him just Alexander, and he was very brave. The young children at Timothy's table looked suitably impressed by this tale, and several turned to peer across the room at Alexander with expressions of awe. Alexander felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but he could not help smiling at Timothy's obvious pride in their shared adventure. Mrs. Whitfield, who was supervising the younger students' dinner, gently encouraged Timothy to sit back down and continue eating, but she caught Alexander's eye across the room and gave him an approving nod. Clearly, word of the afternoon's events had reached the academy administration. After dinner, students dispersed to various evening activities. Some went to the library to complete homework assignments. Others gathered in the common rooms for games and socializing, and a few headed outside to enjoy the last hour of daylight in the gardens. Charlotte suggested that their group might take a final walk around the grounds before evening study time began. The early evening air was cool and pleasant, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of roses and lavender from the gardens. The academy grounds looked different in the soft light, more peaceful, more magical somehow. Other students strolled the paths in small groups, their voices creating a pleasant murmur that blended with the sounds of evening birds settling in for the night. "I must admit," Alexander said as they walked past the lily pond where he had felt so calm earlier, "this day has been quite different from what I expected." "Different how?" Emma asked curiously. Alexander considered his words carefully. "I was frightened this morning. Terrified, actually. I thought everyone would stare at me and expect me to be someone I am not. I thought I would feel like an outsider forever." Charlotte nodded understandingly. "I felt much the same when I first arrived. Even though my family has noble status, I had never been away from home before. Everything seemed enormous and overwhelming. I was homesick for weeks," Henry admitted. "I miss my family's library and my mother's cooking and the quiet of our house. The academy seemed so busy and loud compared to what I was used to." "Really?" Alexander was surprised. Henry seemed so composed and well-adjusted that it was hard to imagine him struggling with the same fears that had plagued Alexander all day. "Oh yes," Henry continued. "I used to hide in the regular library during free time because it was the only place that felt familiar. It took me nearly a month to work up the courage to join any group activities." Emma laughed. "I had the opposite problem. I was so excited to meet new people that I probably scared half the students away with my enthusiasm. It took me a while to learn that not everyone appreciates constant chatter and endless questions." Marco grinned. "I got into trouble my first week for unauthorized exploration, Mrs. Whitfield's term for wandering into places I was not supposed to be. But that's how I discovered most of the interesting features of this place, so I regret nothing." Alexander felt a deep sense of relief, knowing that his new friends had also struggled with the transition to academy life. It made him feel less alone, less abnormal for having found the day challenging. "The important thing," Charlotte said wisely, "is that it does get easier. And today you proved that you are exactly the kind of person this academy needs, someone with both intelligence and character." As they completed their circuit of the grounds and headed back toward the main building, Alexander reflected on how much had changed since that morning. When he had first stepped out of the royal carriage, he had felt like an imposter wearing a costume, pretending to be a regular student while knowing he would never truly fit in. Now, walking with 4 children who had welcomed him as a friend, he began to understand that fitting in did not mean becoming someone else. It meant being brave enough to show who he really was and finding people who appreciated those qualities. The evening study period was held in a comfortable room lined with bookshelves and equipped with individual desks where students could work quietly on their assignments. Alexander found himself seated between Henry, who was working on mathematics problems with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely enjoyed numbers, and Emma, who was writing what appeared to be a very long letter home to her family. Miss Beatrice sat in a chair near the windows, reading a book but keeping a watchful eye on Alexander's first experience with Academy Study Hall. She was pleased to see him settling into the routine naturally, organizing his materials, and beginning his work without any of the anxious fussing that sometimes accompanied new situations. Alexander's first assignment was to write a short essay about his expectations for his time at Elmsworth Academy. As he considered what to write, he thought about how dramatically his expectations had changed since that morning. This morning, he had expected to feel isolated and afraid. He had expected to count the days until he could return home to the safety and familiarity of the castle. Instead, he found himself writing about his hope to make true friends, his excitement about learning new subjects, and his determination to contribute positively to the academy community. When he reached the part about leadership and standing up for others, he paused to remember the feeling he had experienced when confronting Thompson and Blake, the moment when his natural protectiveness had overcome his natural timidity. Perhaps his father had been right about the importance of this experience. Perhaps learning to navigate the wider world really was essential preparation for eventually ruling a kingdom. But more than that, perhaps he was discovering aspects of himself that would have remained hidden if he had stayed safely within the castle walls. As study period drew to a close, students began organizing their materials and preparing for the evening's final activity, a brief assembly in the main hall where announcements were made and achievements were recognized. Alexander followed his new friends toward the hall, no longer feeling like an outsider looking in, but like someone who was beginning to belong. The assembly was brief and informal, with Mrs. Whitfield sharing news about upcoming events and recognizing students who had demonstrated exceptional effort or kindness during the day. When she mentioned that the Academy was pleased to welcome Prince Alexander and thanked the welcoming committee for their assistance, Alexander felt proud rather than embarrassed by the attention. After the assembly, students dispersed to their dormitories for the night. Alexander would be staying in a comfortable room in the main building, with Miss Beatrice in an adjacent chamber until he felt ready to manage on his own. As they climbed the stairs to their floor, Alexander realized that he was genuinely tired rather than simply drained by anxiety. "It has been quite a day," Miss Beatrice observed as they reached Alexander's door. "Yes," Alexander agreed. "But a good day, I think." Miss Beatrice smiled, remembering the shy, frightened boy who had hidden behind her skirts just 12 hours earlier. "Indeed it has been. You should be very proud of yourself, Alexander. You showed remarkable courage and character today." As Alexander prepared for bed, he thought about tomorrow's classes, about his promise to read William's book about Captain Blackwood, about Emma's plan to show him more of the gardens, about Marco's hints regarding secret passages. For the first time since learning he would attend the academy, he found himself looking forward to what the next day might bring. Outside his window, the academy grounds were peaceful under the stars. Somewhere in the building, his new friends were settling into their own routines, probably discussing the day's events and making plans for tomorrow's adventures. Alexander pulled his blankets up to his chin and closed his eyes, no longer the timid, isolated boy who had arrived that morning, but a young man who was beginning to discover his own strength and place in the world. Alexander woke to the sound of gentle rain pattering against his bedroom window. For a moment, he lay still in the unfamiliar bed, momentarily confused by his surroundings. Then, memory flooded back. He was at Elmsworth Academy. This was his second day, and yesterday had been far more successful than he had dared to hope. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Your Highness," came Miss Beatrice's familiar voice. "It is time to rise. Breakfast begins in 30 minutes. As Alexander dressed in his academy uniform, he found that the nervous butterflies that had plagued his stomach yesterday morning had been replaced by something entirely different: anticipation. He was curious about what his classes would hold, eager to continue reading the Captain Blackwood book that William had lent him, and looking forward to spending more time with his new friends. The dining hall was already buzzing with activity when Alexander arrived. Students chatted over their breakfast, sharing plans for the weekend and discussing the previous day's lessons. Several younger children waved at him enthusiastically. Word of his intervention with Timothy had clearly spread throughout the academy. "Good morning, Alexander," Emma called out cheerfully from their usual table. "Did you sleep well? I always have trouble sleeping the first few nights in a new place, but Mrs. Pemberton, that's our house matron, makes the most wonderful chamomile tea if you need help relaxing." Alexander smiled as he took his seat between Henry and Marco. "I slept quite well, thank you. Much better than I expected, actually." Charlotte looked pleased. "That's wonderful. A good night's sleep makes everything seem more manageable." As they ate their breakfast, fresh porridge with honey and cream, warm scones with jam, and fruit from the academy orchards, Alexander found himself truly listening to the conversation around him rather than simply trying to think of appropriate responses. His friends were discussing their plans for Saturday afternoon free time, debating between exploring the old tower that Marco had mentioned or organizing a reading group in the garden. "Why not do both?" Alexander suggested. "We could explore in the morning and read in the afternoon when it gets warmer." "Brilliant idea," Marco said with obvious approval. "I like how you think, Alexander. You're practical, but still adventurous." Henry pushed his spectacles up his nose thoughtfully. "I brought my copy of Principles of Natural Philosophy. It has some fascinating theories about how buildings are constructed to withstand different weather conditions. We could test some of the principles when we examine the tower's architecture." Emma clapped her hands together excitedly. "Oh, this is going to be such fun. Aprupe alcunal adventura." Alexander felt a warm glow of belonging as he listened to their enthusiasm. These children were including him in their plans not because he was a prince, but because they genuinely enjoyed his company and valued his ideas. It was a feeling unlike anything he had experienced before. Their first class of the day was mathematics with Professor Sterling, an energetic woman who had a talent for making numbers interesting and relevant. She began the lesson by presenting them with a practical problem: how to calculate the amount of materials needed to build a small garden wall. Mathematics is not simply abstract theory, she explained as students worked through the problem in small groups. Every calculation has real-world applications. When you determine the area of a rectangle, you're learning skills that architects, farmers, and engineers use every day. Alexander found himself working with Charlotte and Henry, the three of them combining their different strengths to solve increasingly complex variations of the problem. Charlotte had an intuitive grasp of spatial relationships. Henry excelled at the precise calculations, and Alexander proved to have a talent for seeing creative solutions when they encountered obstacles. "You know," Charlotte said thoughtfully as they compared their answers with other groups, "we work well together. We should consider entering the Academy's academic competition next month." "What kind of competition?" Alexander asked. Henry's eyes lit up with interest. Teams of students work together to solve complex problems that require multiple academic skills: mathematics, science, history, literature, and creative thinking. The winning team gets to present their solution to a panel of distinguished visitors, including professors from the Royal University. The idea both excited and intimidated Alexander. He had never participated in any kind of competition before, having always been educated privately and separately from other children. But the thought of working with his friends on challenging problems was appealing. "I would like to try," he said, surprising himself with his decisiveness. "If you think I would be a helpful team member." "Of course you would," Charlotte assured him. "You have excellent analytical skills and creative thinking. Plus, your intervention yesterday showed that you can remain calm and think clearly under pressure." After mathematics came natural philosophy with the enthusiastic Professor Darwin, whom Alexander had glimpsed through the science building windows during his tour. The professor was younger than most of the Academy faculty, with unruly brown hair and clothes that bore evidence of various chemical experiments. Today, Professor Darwin announced with obvious excitement. We shall explore the principles of chemical reactions through hands-on experimentation. You will work in pairs to observe what happens when different substances are combined, recording your observations, and forming hypotheses about the underlying scientific principles. Alexander found himself paired with Emma, whose natural curiosity and fearless approach to new experiences proved to be an excellent complement to his more cautious and methodical nature. As they carefully mixed different powders and liquids according to Professor Darwin's instructions, Alexander discovered the joy of scientific discovery. Look, Emma exclaimed as their first experiment produced a dramatic fizzing reaction and a cloud of harmless but impressive smoke. It's like magic, but it's actually science. Alexander was equally fascinated by the transformation they had created. The professor said that the bubbles indicate a gas is being produced by the chemical reaction. I wonder if different combinations would produce different types of gases. Professor Darwin overheard this question and beamed with approval. Excellent thinking, Prince Alexander. That is exactly the kind of hypothesis that leads to new discoveries. Would you like to design an experiment to test your theory? For the next hour, Alexander and Emma worked together to devise and conduct additional experiments, carefully recording their observations and discussing possible explanations for their results. Alexander found that his natural caution, which he had always considered a weakness, was actually an asset in scientific work. He paid attention to safety procedures and noticed subtle details that others might overlook. By the time the class ended, Alexander's hands were slightly stained with various chemicals. His uniform had acquired a few scorch marks from a particularly enthusiastic flame test, and he was grinning more widely than Miss Beatrice had seen since he was a very small child playing in the castle gardens. I believe, Professor Darwin said as students cleaned up their work areas, that we have some natural scientists among us. Prince Alexander, Miss Sullivan, your experimental method showed excellent logical thinking and careful observation. As they walked toward their next class, Emma chattered excitedly about their experiments while Alexander listened with genuine pleasure. He had never imagined that learning could be so hands-on and immediately rewarding. At the castle, education had always felt like preparation for someday in the distant future. Here, knowledge felt immediate and applicable. Their final class before lunch was art instruction with Miss Thornfield, a gentle woman with paint-stained fingers and an infectious love for creative expression. Her classroom was filled with natural light from tall north-facing windows, and the walls were covered with student artwork that demonstrated impressive skill and imagination. Art, Miss Thornfield explained as students selected their materials, is not simply about creating pretty pictures. It is about learning to see the world carefully, to notice details that others might overlook, and to express ideas and emotions that cannot be captured in words alone. She had arranged several objects on a table in the center of the room, a vase of flowers from the Academy Gardens, some interesting stones, a piece of driftwood with an unusual shape, and an antique brass candlestick. Students were instructed to choose one object and spend the class period creating detailed observational drawings. Alexander selected the piece of driftwood, intrigued by its smooth, organic curves and the way light and shadow played across its weathered surface. As he worked, he found himself becoming completely absorbed in the process of really seeing his subject, noticing how the grain of the wood created subtle patterns, how the light fell differently on each curve and hollow, how the overall shape suggested movement, even though the object was completely still. Excellent work, Alexander, Miss Thornfield said quietly, appearing beside his desk to observe his progress. You have a very good eye for form and shading. Have you had much artistic training? Some drawing lessons at home, Alexander replied modestly. But nothing as focused as this. Miss Thornfield nodded approvingly. Natural talent combined with careful observation. Those are the foundations of good art. I hope you will consider joining our weekend art club. We take sketching expeditions around the countryside and work on longer projects that allow for more creative exploration. The idea of weekend art expeditions appealed to Alexander enormously. He had always found peace in drawing, but he had never considered that it might be something he could share with other people who understood and appreciated the process. Lunch was another pleasant social experience, with conversation flowing easily among his group of friends and extending to include several other students who were beginning to feel comfortable approaching their table. Alexander noticed that his reputation was continuing to evolve. He was no longer seen simply as the royal student, but as Alexander who stood up to Thompson and Blake and the prince who's actually quite nice and normal. After lunch came the afternoon's free time, which Alexander had been anticipating since breakfast. True to their morning plans, Charlotte, Emma, Henry, Marco, and Alexander set off to explore the mysterious old tower that had captured Marco's imagination. The tower stood at the eastern edge of the academy grounds, separated from the main buildings by a small grove of ancient oak trees. It was clearly much older than the rest of the academy, built of darker stone, and showing the weathered appearance of something that had stood for centuries. Ivy climbed halfway up its walls, and narrow windows suggested that it had once served as some kind of watchtower or defensive structure. According to the academy records, Henry said, consulting a small notebook where he had researched the tower's history, it was built in the 13th century as part of a small fortress that once controlled this valley. When the academy was established, they incorporated the tower into their grounds, but have never found a specific use for it. Marco led them to a small door at the tower's base, partially hidden behind a curtain of ivy. This is how I discovered the tower was accessible, he explained. The door isn't locked. I think the academy forgot it existed. Inside, a spiral staircase wound upward through the tower's interior. The stone steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, and narrow windows at regular intervals provided glimpses of the academy grounds from increasingly dramatic perspectives. As they climbed, Alexander found himself thinking about all the people who had used these same steps over the hundreds of years since the tower was built. Soldiers keeping watch, messengers carrying urgent communications, perhaps even young people like themselves exploring and adventuring. The view from the top was spectacular. The entire academy spread out below them like a detailed map, with the main buildings, gardens, and playing fields clearly visible. Beyond the academy grounds, they could see the village where some students' families lived, rolling farmland dotted with sheep and cattle, and in the distance, the mountains that marked the edge of Alexander's father's kingdom. "It's beautiful," Alexander said softly, impressed by the scope of the view and the sense of perspective it provided. "Look," Emma pointed toward the main building. "You can see students moving around like tiny ants. And there's Professor Darwin in his garden, probably collecting specimens for Monday's lesson." Henry had brought his notebook and was sketching the layout of the academy grounds as seen from above, noting architectural features and spatial relationships that were not apparent from ground level. Charlotte was examining the tower's construction methods, running her hands along the stone joints and marveling at the skill of medieval builders. Marco, meanwhile, was investigating every corner and crevice of the tower's upper chamber, convinced that such an old structure must contain hidden compartments or secret features. His persistence was rewarded when he discovered that one of the stones in the eastern wall was slightly loose. "Help me move this," he called excitedly. Working together, they managed to shift the stone aside, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a collection of items that had clearly been hidden there deliberately: a leather-bound journal, several old coins, a small silver pendant, and what appeared to be a letter sealed with wax. "We shouldn't disturb these things," Charlotte said immediately. "They obviously belong to someone, even if that someone lived long ago." Alexander agreed, though he was intensely curious about the contents of the journal and letter. "We should report this discovery to Mrs. Whitfield. These items might be historically significant." Henry was practically vibrating with excitement. "Just think, we may have discovered artifacts that have been hidden for